started, thank you all for coming out to this very special Broad Underground screening. The Broad Underground is a monthly series of screenings that we put on. It's in collaboration with Film Studies and English departments on the MSU campus. This screening in particular is very special to us. We're honored and very privileged to be able to bring back to the museum artist David Lamelas, who is our current exhibiting artist. If you're not aware already, he has a fantastic exhibition open right now on our first floor, Fiction of a Production, that was curated by our associate curator, Carla Yates. Fantastic show. If you haven't seen it, please check it out. So tonight, we're going to enjoy a screening, but we're also happy to be joined by Daniel Ricardo Quiles from the Art Institute of Chicago. So what we're going to do is we're going to enjoy a short presentation by Daniel, giving some background to David's practice. We're going to go into a screening of 3 short films of David's. Actually, 2 of the films are co-directed by Hildegarde Duane. So we'll watch those 3 films, and then we'll enjoy a conversation between David and Daniel. And afterwards, have a little time for Q&A as well, as we usually do. So I'm going to allow or invite up Carla to do some proper introductions of our guests tonight. So please help me welcome
So welcome. Thank you so much for coming this evening. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction to both David and Daniel, and I want to say thank you so much, David, for coming all the way to Michigan to be with us tonight. We're honored to have you here, and thank you so much, Daniel, for agreeing to come and talk about David's practice. David Lamelas is widely recognized as a pioneer of conceptual art. Ranging from sculpture to film, photography, and performance, his interdisciplinary practice has influenced artists across the Americas and Europe. Lamelas studied at the Academia Nacional de Bellas Artes in Buenos Aires and became a key member of the Argentinian avant-garde that formed around the Instituto Torquato Di Tella. He participated in landmark exhibitions at the Institute, which at the time was under the directorship of the influential curator and critic Jorge Romero Brest, and won its jury special award in 1966. Lamelas represented Argentina at the Bienal de Sao Paulo in 1967, where he received the Sculpture Prize for his installation, Dos Espacios Modificados, 2 modified spaces. In 1968, he presented Office of Information about the Vietnam War at 3 levels, the visual image, text, and audio at the Venice Biennale. The installation, which addressed the shifting nature of time and communication in a burgeoning information society, marked the beginning of the artist's career in Europe. In the same year, Lamelas relocated to London to study under Anthony Caro at the prestigious St. Martin's School of Art. Through the 1970s and well beyond, Lamelas continued to show his work in important conceptual art exhibitions in Europe and the United States, including Prospect 68, Kunsthalle Düsseldorf, 1968, curated by Conrad Fisher, Information, Museum of Modern Art, New York, 1970, curated by Kynaston McShine, and Documenta 5 Castle, 1974, curated by Howard Seaman, among many others. He has produced many films, some in collaboration with Hildegarde Duane, that blur reality and fiction. In 1976, Lamelas moved to Los Angeles, and since then, he has led a nomadic life and artistic practice between Europe, the United States, and South America. Daniel Ricardo Quiles is an associate professor of art history, theory, and criticism at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where he teaches courses on the theory and history of post-war art of the Americas. His research on Latin American conceptualism, video, and television art has appeared in academic journals such as Art Journal, Art Margins, and Cayana, in addition to edited volumes and exhibition catalogs, including the recent Pacific Standard Time exhibition, David Lamelas, A Life of Their Own. He recently published a book-length interview with Jaime Davidovich as part of Fundación Cisneros' Conversation series. He is also an art critic who has written for Art Forum, Art in America, and This Magazine, among other publications. He's a 2003-2004 Critical Studies Fellow in the Whitney Independent Study Program, received the 2013 Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant, and was the 2013-2014 postdoctoral fellow in the Institute of Modern and Contemporary History at École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Quiles.
Well, I'm so grateful to Carla and to Brian and the whole staff here at the Broad for bringing me through. It's an honor always to speak about David's work, especially with him right here. He's going to be available to fact check anything that I say when we speak after the films. This was what I was able to come up with when asked to provide 10 minutes of context for David Lamelas' film practice. And so I have to start with the caveat that this is a very partial view of a multi-decade practice. But I'm hoping to at least draw a few connections between the work that is up, that you can see in person, and the videos and films that are going to screen in just a few minutes. What I would say, and it's nice to be able to give a context talk in relationship to David's practice, because I would argue that an important component of his practice has to do with the context in which the work is exhibited or perhaps made. And there was a lovely video being screened just over there a few moments ago of the production of this work, the installation of Untitled Falling Wall here at the Broad, where what you see about this work is how, among other things, it really captures Zaha Hadid's architecture in a new way. It adds something quite literally to the existing architecture, and it also reveals aspects of space that are always in play at in this building, in this institution. And I would say that in Lamelas' practice, it's never just a question of space or volume. It's always the setting, the social context, the institutional implications of how that space or volume is functioning. I would argue there's a kind of fluid transit between the two. And so this is an easy place to start for thinking about David's work, but I would caution that it wouldn't be quite right to simply declare him a sculptor. After all, this is an artist who's worked in a variety of media throughout his career. This is the aforementioned piece that won a prize at the Dictator Institute, 1966. What I would point out, and I don't have my cursor because this is not my computer, so one of my teaching tools is I don't have, but you'll just have to look. This, what today we would call an installation, this kind of sculpture, added an element to the existing architecture in the Dictator that connected multiple rooms. And so this was a sculpture that the viewer could not see all at once, but instead, in effect, had to trace or follow throughout the institution, in a sense, accruing knowledge about the site, about the context, as one experienced the work of art. This isn't a sculpture that's in one place that one just views and gets all at once. Instead, it connects space and time, and I think this is a very important aspect of Lamelas' work, one that is certainly continuous with his film practice. I forgot to time myself. I'm going to start now. Here, yet another example. This is another work that's in the show. And here, I think one thing that's worth pointing out is what I would call tact or economy of means, the use of these fairly simple rectangular plates simply to demarcate different objects or indeed people in any given site. And just to use this very simple ... like connection, this creation of a frame in a sense. a very similar operation taking place here. And this is another work you can experience in person at this show. But I think in the context of what I'm talking about, which is trying to think about film, I think it's relevant that this is projected light. Although it's interesting to think that it's not projected image. It's not what we normally think of as film, and yet it's the material that you need for film to take place. There's also a recent essay in the volume for the Pacific Standard Time retrospective that thinks about this as a sort of spotlight from which the celebrity is missing. But it's like the kind of apparatus or the situation that needs to happen for a celebrity to appear within a spotlight. I love this idea. And then quite logically, and this work is also in the show, projecting light onto the wall. Here, simply an empty slide, and so the obvious invitation is for the viewer to walk in front of that projected light and to, in effect, become the person on the screen. This is, for me, a very important work because it's an overlap between these, for lack of a better term, sculptural interventions in gallery space, and an interest in the mass media that's equally important to Lamelas' work throughout the 60s and 70s. This work, a set of 17 televisions, and I think it's important to note that at the Ditela Institute, the main sponsor of all the exhibits there was a corporation, Siam Ditela. It's one of the major industrial producers of household goods and cars in Argentina in the 50s and 60s. And so by using Ditela televisions in this installation, the artist is folding the institution, its very financial apparatus that allows it to exist, into the work itself, using it as if it were material. However, it's also relevant that nothing was on these televisions other than static that was turned up loud. And this brings me to the question of what I would call people. However, what sort of people should we think of as celebrities, or the kinds of people that appear in the mass media and in movies, for example, or in popular culture? And so I always am interested in this early work by David, actually painting. There's not a lot of painting in his career, but just a little bit at the beginning. Here, portraits, in a sense, of the tango superstar, Carlos Gardel. And then, for me, there would be a connection about 10 years later to the artist taking portraits of himself as a rock star. And within the title itself, we're told it's a character appropriation, whatever that is, in a sense, reproducing oneself as star, but of course also as a kind of generic figure. I think this is very important, that to treat the mass media, to treat something like celebrity, film, pop culture, as just systems that operate, that have conditions, that have contexts, much in the same way that museums do, in the way that they exhibit and legitimate works of art and artists. And of course, this work Carla mentioned also, it's a very, very important transition point in Lamelas' career, moving from Argentina, which was at that time being ruled by a military dictatorship, to Europe. This is the first work that's shown. And what you don't see in this documentation of this work is that this office of information, as the artist calls it, is actually behind glass. It's in a kind of minimalist container, a sort of glass box. And so I think that gesture shouldn't be lost. The idea that the artist frames the whole thing. What is the whole thing? So you've got information about the Vietnam War, which was then at an absolute crisis point, 1968. The information is coming in off of the newswire in real time. In the proper performance of this installation at Venice, there would have been a secretary reading this news as it came in. So there's multiple registers of information. Perhaps you've already noticed this, that with so many of these works, I would point to this one as well, there's a kind of fragmentation of the experience of the work. You don't get it all at once. You're given these multiple registers. You know, you have to make sense of them. You have to put them together. And perhaps they don't even link up perfectly. You know, you're confronted with the fact that they don't quite align. So here, thinking about that in terms of different registers of media. And a similar fragmentation or splitting up of the material that the viewer gets is present in the artist's first film, a study of the relationships between inner and outer space, which examines one art institution in London in great detail, almost exhaustive, obsessive detail. It starts by, and you can see it here in this lower image, looking at almost every inch of the art institution, describing all of its features, the architectural design, the different equipment that's there to show art. Different members of the museum staff are interviewed and talk about what they do for the institution. But then, interestingly, the film begins to back farther and farther and farther out in this context and simply starts to talk about London and its train systems and how many newspapers there are, and is as if trying to consider every possible factor of context. Then, and this is the same film, there's a fascinating final section, and this film is being screened, by the way, in this show. This final section features a series of interviews, sort of person-in-the-street interviews about the recent moon landing, and sort of as if suddenly from considering every possible factor, including the mass media in London, it's suddenly as if you're within the mass media. Suddenly you're just experiencing television news and getting information in this way. So a totally fascinating film. I think it's great that it's the only film that you see in this show, because it's worth taking a lot of time and really putting on the headphones and sitting there and experiencing it. Moving along, I think this film, Time as Activity, is representative of where Lamelas's filmic practice would go. The distinctive feature of this film and a number of the works from this moment around 1969, 1970, is that one gets to experience time passing, almost like existentialist, just time as it is. Now that might sound potentially boring, but that would be your opinion. To me, I think it's actually quite fascinating. What would that mean if film could give you the experience of something like time itself? Here, I just want to read very, very quickly. I was going back over some of the wonderful interviews that David has given over the years, and I did find this lovely quote. The interviewer asks, but couldn't you say that you sculpt time, asking about his films? And David replies, space. Space is time. It's the same thing. Time doesn't exist. Our consciousness constructs it. Time is a fiction. It doesn't exist. But space has a reality. It exists. So, Time as Activity. Dusseldorf consists of several different stretches of time. You can see here that it's 4 minutes. In this, and in certain shots in the film, you're just looking at different scenes in the city of Dusseldorf. Just traffic passing by. And keep this in mind when we watch In Our Time, David's latest film today, because I think there's a fascinating connection to this much earlier moment in his practice. And this, a text related to that film, and I like this text here. What occurs on the screen has no aesthetic meaning. The projections show just time in the city where Prospect 69, the exhibition that the film was made for, where Prospect takes place. So, because this to me is an interesting declaration. There's no aesthetic meaning. This is just, in a sense, what passed in front of the camera, time itself. And this is a work from that moment, not a film, but a series of photographs that I think interweaves very nicely David's interest in people, and again, I'm using that term in a very open-ended sense, people in relationship to time, to his films. Here, a series of portraits of his friends, colleagues, art dealer, people, curators in Antwerp and Brussels that he knew, and shown at very particular, like the very hour in which the photographs were taken is added to their names. I have to rush because I'm out of time, but here's another phase from very much the same moment in David's films. Interview with Marguerite Duras was part of, there was a plan to do 3 different interviews. One with Duras, who is a famous writer. I believe the others were supposed to be famous fashion designer and a socialist politician. So always this like multiple registers. And this works significantly, as are many of David's films from this time. It's installed in such a way that you never just see the film, you also see other material. So you can see on the wall that in addition to the film taking place, she's being interviewed by a wonderful writer, Raoul Escari, a close friend of Lamelas's who lived in Paris at that time. You have still photographs of Duras, and you have texts that are taken out of context from the interview. So on the one hand, you have the film as if that were going to be a complete experience in itself, but then you're also given these other materials in different sorts of media that make you question the idea that the film is a totality. Everything is always being fragmented, broken up in David's work. Quite literally fragmented here in one of his most famous films, To Pour Milk into a Glass. The same glass is shown being gradually filled with milk, but then strangely the milk seems to reach the limit of the glass, and then in the final sequence the glass breaks. It's as if a system is set up and then the system falls apart. And then there is a period in the mid-70s where from Europe, David moves to Los Angeles, becomes involved in the rising culture around video that, among other places, was being generously supported by the Long Beach Museum of Art and its then director, David Ross. And it's here that he begins to experiment with video. This work actually was made in Canada right around that time, just before his permanent settling in Los Angeles at that moment. It's called The Hand. And I want you to keep this in mind as we watch the first of these videos we're going to see, The Dictator, because the television show that we ostensibly see, a sort of news interview magazine, is the same. It has the same name as The Hand. And The Hand, there's another of these sort of ambiguous figures, sort of generic folk singer, maybe a bit like a Bob Dylan, who's interviewed and repeatedly asked over and over again if he is a political artist. And he keeps trying to fend off the question and evade and never quite have to say, yes, I'm political. And then at the end of the video, he's mysteriously assassinated. Just a hand appears out of nowhere and throws a knife, and that's it. So the register, I think, around this time with the videos, and we can discuss this, shifts a bit toward something like parody, although I personally have never been able to find quite the right word to describe what's happening here. But at very least, I would say there's a close dialogue with television. You could think of something like the protocols of television, the television interview. What does it mean when any person is put on television and asked questions? I don't want to neglect the fact that in recent years, David has continued making videos and films. Here, a brilliant adaptation of the Argentinian novel, The Invention of Dr. Morel, 2000. And in more recent years has been, in a sense, restoring, although I think you're going to have to help me decide just how much elements of narrative and genre to his videos and films. Genres like suspense or romance. I'll leave it at that because I think you'll get plenty more information from watching the films themselves. David had wanted me to mention that The Dictator, the first film we're going to watch, was originally made in 1978. And it was part of these films, these videos, sorry, that were produced in Los Angeles at that moment. So I hope I didn't go over too much, and I hope you enjoy these 3 works that you're about to see.
Thank you, Daniel. We'll just take 1 minute here for a quick transition.
Newsmakers, the program of the men and women who make the news. Today we have as our special guest, Colonel Ricardo Garcia Perez, ex-presidente of Santa Ana, a country that has recently been in the news because of spectacular oil discoveries. It is a country that has seen very many governments come and go, a country where political chaos has become almost a lifestyle. A year ago, Colonel Perez Garcia was overthrown by a military junta in a violent and ruthless manner. He now lives in Los Angeles in extreme seclusion and has granted us this special interview. Today we will try and discover what is behind this man that some people have called dictator, poet, revolutionary. From a popular figure to a ruthless, unpopular man. Has opinion changed? Or has the man himself changed? Mr. Presidente, can you tell us why you've chosen the U.S., and particularly Los Angeles, to make your home in exile?
Because I feel safe here. People's concerns are not politics in this town. I could not think of any other place in the world where politics seems to be so irrelevant.
Can you give us some explanation for your overthrow? Did your supporters turn against you, or had times just changed, or what would you attribute this to?
Well, times have changed a lot, as you may know. Because our reasons is because of foreign ideologies trying to break into Santa Ana.
What do you mean by foreign ideologies?
Communism.
Now, the press in the country has variously called you a dictator. How do you feel about this?
Well, as you would imagine, I wouldn't like that very much at all.
Is it true that certain journalists were actually arrested and put on trial for subversive activities in your country?
Partially true. But I said before, this is a problem of a very small section of the community, and some of them call themselves journalists, periodistas, as we say in Spanish, as we say in Santa Ana. But who do they know about Santa Ana? They don't know nothing about my people, and they try to break in foreign patterns of behavior into a country like ours.
So you actually think that this restraint on the press has been a positive thing?
It has been for 10 years. My government did work for 10 years, so it did work, in fact. Many of them, some of them, small sections of them, are not happy about it, but most of them are.
According to our researchers, there was actually quite limited freedom of the press, and all media had to be submitted to a censorate to decide whether or not it would be made public. Is this true?
It is true. It is true. As I said, the bad press, the decadent aspect of the press, has been repressed as it is in most countries.
Well, I think in our country, Watergate has shown that a press can be independent, powerful, and incisive.
We wouldn't be so sure about it. Don't forget that the media is in this country a big source of power, and without a doubt, strong economical interests.
Getting on to the question of civil liberties, though, the press aside, there have been accusations that you severely limited the freedom in the universities. Universities were closed, the professors were intimidated, that students were turned out of the classrooms. Is this true?
Well, if you put it that way, but it's once again is professors who may be living out of the country for 10 years come back to Santa Ana, carrying French books, Italian, English books into our libraries. Have nothing to do with Santa Ana realities.
And what's happened to these people? What are the professors?
Well, they're working now. They're working in factories. They're working in the land. They're useful people. Who do you need them for anyway?
Yes, but there's the question of human rights. Now, 2 years ago, the League of International Human Rights requested permission to come to Santa Ana and conduct an investigation. Yet this request was summarily turned down by your office. Do you have any comment on this?
Well, I was away at the time. I was in Russia on an official visit, and my associates, government associates, decided that should be done at the time, and it was done, and I think it did work. All of these international organizations have many, many different faces and fronts, but in the very end, they're all very, very similar. They're trying to bring chaos and discontent for the ultimate success of communism.
Well, don't you think you've rather exaggerated the threats of communism?
Not at all. They are the worst enemies that the human race had ever had.
Can you tell us something about your life in Los Angeles? Now that you have been relieved of your responsibilities as president, exactly what do you spend your time doing?
Well, during the morning hours, I take care of Santa Ana politics from exile. We are aware of everything that is daily going on there, and we join here in my house with 5 of my best members, those who moved with me to this town, and we planned our comeback to Santa Ana, as we eventually will. We eventually succeed and destroy those who are there right now.
So you're planning to return?
Yes, I am. Yes, I will. We will.
And how will you bring this about?
Well, as a matter of policy, we won't be able to tell you right now about it. You will know it when actually it will happen.
And what about your other activities? I've heard that you're writing a book. Is this true?
Oh, yes. I am writing a book about my last 10 days in power, about the truth, about everything I've done, and about those who have different ideas about me.
And I've heard that you actually have offers from Hollywood producers for this book.
Oh, yes, but it's far too early yet to say anything about it.
But in this film, you'll be the hero.
Oh, not exactly the hero. Will be there, will be the main character. I can only write about me, and I can only govern people that I know that's why I want to go back to Santa Ana. That's why they want me back there and would be there.
And who will be the bad guys?
The bad guys, if you call them that way, will be those who took me out of power.
And what about romance? Is there a love interest in your story?
Yes, there is. There is strong romance in the story, which is my ex-wife Manolita, who I miss her very badly.
How did you meet her?
She was, I met her in Puerto Rico, in fact, in an official visit. She was working in a nightclub. Then she came to me and said, you are Ricardo? I said, yes, and invited her a drink, and then she proved to be an intelligent woman, so I brought her to Santa Ana, I educated her, I gave her everything she needed that she had not before, and then she became my wife, and that's how it happened.
Did she play any political role in the life of Santa Ana?
Yes, she did. She became, for the last 5 years, she was a very strong woman, a powerful woman. In fact, I didn't like that too much at the time.
Was she popular with your people?
She was, in fact.
Had several ex-wives, isn't this true? She's number 3, 4?
She's number 5, in fact.
And can you tell us what's happened to all these other wives?
Yes, they all had tragic accidents.
Tragic
Let's
accidents?
say. Yes.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, there was God's wish that they should rest in peace by now.
Isn't it an unlikely coincidence that 5 women, 5 deaths in 15 years?
It is a coincidence, but as you may know, my life has been overruled by tragedy.
Do you feel responsible in any way for these women and their deaths?
Yes, I do, because for some reason I just choose women, weak women, who cannot survive to strong emotional conflict. And since my life has been overruled by constant takeovers and political chaos and political misunderstandings, they just can't take it anymore, so they go.
And what actually happened to Manolita?
Manolita was sweetheart. What do you want to know about Manolita?
The circumstances of her death.
Well, it was about 3 in the morning. We were home. We had, we call the pink house, Casa Rosada, that's how we call it. And we went to an official party the night before. Everything was okay, and 3 in the morning, the planes sort of kept on flashing over the house, and Manolita was the first one, in fact, to hear about it. And she woke me up, and she said, Ricardo. I said, what's that? What it is? Manolita was off-white, and no blood was in her eyes. She was almost dead. So by the time I couldn't care less about the planes, I was caring about Manolita herself. And that moment, some people just broke into the apartment, some kind of guys with little arms, and so Manolita just couldn't take it, so she went in my arms. That's the way it happened.
So she actually died in your arms?
Yes, she died just right here.
Now you were the strong man in Santa Ana for almost 20 years. If you had it to do over again, is there anything that you do differently?
I would keep Manolita aside. I won't keep her home till she won't be dead by now.
Beauty is love made real. And because we love our jobs, and we love beauty, and we love love, and we love God, we are for Marcos.
Now that I am your president, we have been free only for 20 years. We have to find out who we really are. Only then we'll know what it means to be a Filipino. It does take a lot of courage to live in freedom, and we do have it with me. Let's get to work.
Passengers may proceed to the
gate area before check-in.
Corazon,
You don't even smoke and you're taking cigarettes. Are you going to spend our last dollar?
this is mine. Mine. The country's mine.
Oh, not anymore.
How can you be so ungrateful? So ungrateful. Oh.
You killed my husband.
Oh, your little slender, having betrayed by my own people.
Goodbye to you and all your cronies.
You are the puppet now. And don't forget that we need those American bases.
Compared to her, Marie Antoinette was a bad lady.
People criticize me for loving beauty. They say beauty is a luxury. Yet it is beauty that feeds the soul.
Let me tell you, it isn't beautiful out there in the wasteland.
Let's get on with the interview. This is our latest line. Entirely radioactive proof. Transparent, yet steel could not go through it. Are you getting this down? We're launching a new line and we want the world to know.
What's left of the whole world?
We've packed our bags once and we're not about to do it again.
What are you talking about?
You should have seen me then. I made a Roman airliner go back to the airport because they were out of cheese. I had tons of white sand brought to my favorite beach because its own sand wasn't white enough. I danced with movie stars. I had mansions. Science I founded the University of Life. I was a soldier for beauty. They call me corrupt, frivolous. But I would not look like this if I am corrupt. Some ugliness would settle down on my system.
They say you spent millions on facelifts.
I do not want to be an ugly old corpse. One of these days you will see me hanging from a tree. The beauty of me is that I'm not attached to anything. Not even life. These are my designer fingernails, the Amalda line. Would you like some cakes? Made to look real, but alas, they are fakes.
I'm looking at you, Imelda. No, my breast tomato.
I've been down in the mines longer than I can remember.
All right. Give it, eat it.
So what are you doing now?
I'm just growing these tomatoes. I want to go back to my country and live with my people.
Still collecting nails.
It takes a lot of courage to live in freedom.
Your country has been erased from the globe.
Has it? The very own people who claimed they were working for democracy, in fact, they were fighting democracy.
Democracy. I hadn't heard that word in years.
What happened to the man who pressed the button by accident?
That Hollywood actor. He died some 20 years ago.
Then I am the last one. The last hero. A hero dares to do what nobody else dares to do. Jesus Christ, Franco, Gandhi, and me.
There is nothing out there. And here you are, with your tomatoes and your lingerie. And all it takes is to open the window. And then all
Don't do it! Don't!
ik weet het. Je bent very sorry, Jacqueline. A little bit more time. Remember us in 1974? Our time?
I know.
Jacqueline, je sais pas. Remember us? Ben je zo vergeten, Jacqueline? Je sais pas, Jacqueline. A bit more time, Jacqueline. Just a few more days. Okay.
We paid for a hotel in Ostend for you for 2 weeks so you could get past your writer's block.
I need more
And
time.
what do you mean you need more time? By Friday, or you can find yourself a new agent.
Buenos días, Jacqueline. ¿Todo bien?
Sir Dan, do you like my dress?
Oh, yes, very much.
This Dictator, James Ensor, is Christ's entry into Brussels, which was made in 1888, but the painting is called Christ Entered into Brussels, 1889. Now, very important is that the painting was actually censored by a group called the XX. The XX was an artist association in Belgium, different artists that are collaborating. And James Ensor was one of the founders of that organization. The painting was censored because it was so controversial for them. Therefore, the painting was hidden from the public. Now, another really fun fact about James Ensor is that he was born in Ostend and he stayed in Ostend and he never left Ostend because he loved it that much. Excuse me, Madam Sir.
Oh, it's fine. Sorry.
James Ensor loved the city of Ostend more than anywhere else. He even insisted on staying here during the Second World War, despite the risk of the enemy bombs, of course. James Ensor hield echt van Ostende en bleef daarvoor ook zijn hele leven hier. Hij, zelfs tijdens de Tweede Wereldoorlog wilde hij hier blijven, desondanks dat er wat bommen zouden kunnen vallen. And so James Ensor did. He passed away in Ostend in 1949. Excuse me. Sorry, please would you make way? Thank you. That's all I could do. Thank you. Are there any questions from you? Okay, then I will see you guys all next week. Thank you so much. I love the movement in this painting.
Me too. It's really interesting what you were saying about the painting.
Do you mind?
Not at all. I'm Jacko, by the way.
Enchanté. Je m'appelle Marcel.
What's this?
That. Jim.
What I find fascinating about this painting is the composition, of course, but also the faces.
That's good. You do it very well.
Also the richness of the brushstrokes, just layer on layer.
You from the USA?
Yes,
From where?
California.
California dreaming. And one day, I think, this painting will be in Los Angeles.
Happy the day in a dream.
Dreaming on a summer's day at the Town Hotel.
It's Winter's Day. And how did you...
I saw you sitting there the other day. I got him at some him to write.
I know.
In fact, I was going right now. Can I see your drawings again?
Can I see what's in it?
Do you know what James Ensor's banner saying?
Wrong with socialism.
Oh, that's a bad name in my country.
But socialism is good for us.
I didn't know I was dating a commie.
All right, take it.
Me.
part of your story.
Is that you, mon amour? Merci, madame.
Señoras y señores, el museo cerrado. Ladies and gentlemen, the museum is now closed. Madam, the museum is closed.
Come to visit you in California.
Yes.
Could begin in New York to verschieden. Jacqueline! I'm forgetting you already.
We are not.
And one day, I think, this painting will be in Los Angeles.
That would be the day of the dream.
Well, thank you for watching the film.
I think you have to put this on.
Oh.
Can you hear us?
Yeah. 1, 2, 3. Is that okay?
Okay. So I wanted to start by, David, asking you about, I think it makes sense to go backwards, to start with this new film.
I never saw them together, but it was your choice, but it was an interesting choice. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we can talk about that too. But, I think the question of why the James Ensor is a great place to begin to think about the film that we just saw in our time.
Well, James Ensor, because James Ensor painting the entrance of Jesus Christ into Brussels is part of my history, because when I first moved to Europe, I briefly visited for many times the city of Antwerp in Belgium. And across the street from where I was staying, which is the Gallery YY Space Gallery, I visited this museum, and the entrance lobby was this magnificent painting. And that was in 1970, and I kept seeing that painting until 74, 75, 78. Then the painting disappeared, and kind of forgot about the painting. And then years later, I saw that in the 80s, I saw that painting in Los Angeles at the Getty Museum. And I was in Brussels when it was a huge scandal because James Ensor, the painter himself, gave on permanent loan to the Antwerp Museum of Fine Arts the painting, not a gift, not sold, just a permanent loan. And then the painting was moved to Tokyo in the early 80s for a retrospective of Ensor in Tokyo. So the state of Ensor decided to sell the painting, and that was a huge national scandal because it was the national patrimoine of Belgium, and
the national
patrimony of Belgium. So it was a huge political scandal about the art trade of international major works. But suddenly the painting was where I was, so it was very interesting. I was in Los Angeles, so it was the painting, So that was interesting to me. And then about last year, when I was proposed to make this a short movie. So then the idea came back, and then the reason of the Ensor painting is answers your question.
I also wanted to ask about, I took a few stills to show, your interest in the institution, the art institution, to me is particularly intriguing in this film. We're shown the painting in what seem to be several locations, and we also see a lot of the of just institutional space. For example, I particularly like the cafeteria at the Getty Center, which I personally recognize. For those of you who haven't been, the Getty Center is in Los Angeles. It's up very high on this hill, so you have a tremendous view of the surrounding area. But instead of simply setting these scenes in the galleries themselves, we even see that kind of the functional spaces in the museum.
No, yeah, to answer your question, but in a way, it's site specific, because the painting was at the Getty. They were paying for my show, so it's a little bit, again, using the institution as part of my work, very much like the Dictator TV sets, in a very different form, but somehow working with the system itself as my sort of work, sort of thing.
How, in that sense, should we think about this love story that's sort of placed alongside or in these locations?
Yeah. What was your question? Why the love story?
Yeah, in a sense.
Why the love story? Well, well, you know, it's something I never touched before in my work, which is human emotion. So I thought it's about time that is so important in my life, in our lives, to touch that subject, you know. So, and it wasn't autobiographical, but somehow during those years at the White Space Gallery, I also had love affairs. So it was part of my life then, so why not use it?
Okay. I also wanted to ask about sound, which to me is one of the most intriguing parts of this film. The opening, we hear what sounds like a clock ticking. We also hear waves, footsteps.
Well,
There's
you
a
know,
lot of rhythmic sounds.
yeah, I like to work. Well, one of the things I like is is I like to work with other artists. They could be a carpenter, it could be a musician, it could be director of photography. So I give them freedom within some directions. And the soundtrack was made by Gavan Gamboa, which is a wonderful composer. I worked with him before. I worked with him on an installation 4 years ago. And then when this movie happened, I just showed him the film, and I gave him a few ideas, and I gave him freedom, and then he showed me the first sound draft, and then we worked on it. And so, what was your question about the music? Why it was?
Well, among other things, I do notice in those opening sequences.
It's a clock.
It's a clock.
Yeah, kind of a clock. Yeah, yeah.
Because once again, you list the names of cities, even times of day. There's just what seems like almost a little tiny return to these shots that are just.
Well, yeah, you have to look. You know, it's a story. It's a short story. You have to tell a very complex story. In how long is the movie? It's
22 minutes.
Well, in 22 minutes, very short time to explain a story. So then I had to be very. It's almost like a poem rather than a novel. You know, so in a novel, you can explain the details, and in a poem you don't. You have to move from one thing to another. So this is more like a poem, and the soundtrack has to be a liaison, a connection between the different letters or images. You know, so the soundtrack is a connection of the images.
I wanted to, one of the reasons that I thought it might be nice to see these earlier works, these particular videos, was that they were made in Los Angeles, and a big component of this film has to do with Los Angeles. But also the presence of Hildegarde Duane, who was a collaborator on both projects, and who also, along with you, appears in them. And you do appear in this film, although more in a sort of Hitchcockian cameo style. But in terms of these earlier videos, I'm curious about the nature of your collaboration.
Well, when I first moved to United States, Los Angeles, from London, before I moved here, I was a Londoner for 10 years. So I became very British here. So in fact, everybody thought I was a young British artist, And soon after that, they realized I wasn't a young British artist. So I was an Angelino artist, from LA. So one of the things that impressed me the most in the United States was television. In London, we had 2 channels, black and white, and the news were read by a very serious reader, going like this, reading and facing the camera, with no sense of humor, very BBC of that era. And then here it was a spectacle. The news were, flashy sets, the entertainment of the news. So that really affected me. So I decided to work with politics as entertainment. That was the decision, And then one of the things that I was also interested was, even though I have never been a political artist direct, politics interests me as a spectacle. And then there was a very new, the talk show was new in the United States then. And also one of the things that was very interesting, that women were given hard news to do, like Barbara Walters was the first women journalist to do hard news. She interviewed heads of state, which until then women were interviewing fashion designers, artists, writers, So I was based on that too. I was very impressed by news, and hard news were sort of presented as womanship so then Barbara Lopez came out of Barbara Walters, and since I was coming from Argentina, I was also interested in how the media, U.S. media, saw Latin America as politics. So that was the making of the concept, and also because before this one had made The Hand, which is about this young rock and roll star who faded out of the public eye for about 10 years. He's planning a comeback, but there gossip around him that he is maybe has some political alliances that are not so good for us. So this reporter, Barbara Walters type, pushes him to tell the truth. And just about when he's to tell the ultimate truth, or his own truth, he's been murdered by an anonymous hand on the set of television. That's what's called The Hand. And it was censorship in a way, it was not a literal murder, they just cut him off, that's all. So that's, and then I moved to Los Angeles, and David Ross from Long Beach was curating a video. Every year or 2 years he made a video program. So he was, and when I moved to LA, I wanted to do film. So and David, film, you have to do a lot of things to raise money. So I tried for a long time, and then it was hard, and David kept saying, David, do video, do video. So then he gave me his equipment in Long Beach, and that's why he came back with The Dictator. And with all the technicians and people from Long Beach, and then artists from LA like William Levitt and Hildegarde Duane. So it became a cooperative project, and it was my first, let's say, time in front of the camera, So it's like completely unprofessional,
I'm thinking a bit more, because one thing I'd love to do is think a little bit about how those two videos, and of course this one, how they relate to the politics of their moment, because I think
well, they're all very related, because the first one with The Dictator was just short. After, I don't remember the name, but some dictator arrived in the United States from his country. So that was inspired on the actual truth. And then the Manila Run was just during the same year that President Marcos was expelled from his country with his wife Imelda, and they were very much in the news, and they were sort of inspiration for this video. And one of the things, everything that we say, about 75% of what Hildegarde Duane says there were quotes from Imelda Marcos. So we did a collage, and then we made a script, but actual things that they said. You know, a little bit on my side was a little bit more of improvised, but Hildegarde Duane was almost 80% was quotes of Imelda.
I like that in the final sequence it almost seems like another of these interviews, but it's as if the interview itself is literally disintegrating. You know, there are these nuclear attacks. They all seem to be dying, but also it's as if the interview itself, the interviewer, you know, eats her cake and seems on the verge of attacking them, and isn't,
well,
but still asking questions.
Yeah, outside is chaos. It has been pollution is so bad, but these people, they live in a dream world of their own, with all the money stolen. Somehow they manage to survive, and the journalist is what is left of the media.
So videos that turn populists and perhaps dictators into archetypes of corruption and charisma. How are you feeling these days about these videos that date back several decades?
I feel very strange. I feel very strange when I think about what we did then and the world today. And when I say the world, I mean the whole world. I don't feel very good about it.
Well, I could ask a million questions, but I think it might be good to have some Q&A from the audience. So please, anyone who might have a question.
We'll open it up to questions. We'll use the microphone if we can. This is on. Can we get the handheld turned on? Does anyone have a question?
Yes, there we go. There it is.
So this is a question that kind of started the first time you were here, and seeing the videos, I really feel like there has to be some kind of connection, and I'm just curious about the role that, like, if the writer Borges from Argentina
yes.
Explores time as space a lot, and I just was curious whether or not any Borges short stories in particular, because he was so focused on the short story as a way of exploring a topic, a huge topic that could have easily been an entire novel in such a short space, if that influenced you in your work, especially with the videos that we saw today, but also in your art, in your conceptual art.
You're talking about the length of the videos or conceptually?
Conceptually, tackling these massive concepts in short or in the short form.
Well, to be honest with you, Borges was so popular in Argentina, but I really started to read Borges in London, unfortunately I have to say. And then when I started to read Borges in English, I thought that we had things in common. That was very strange. I said, oh, well, he thinks like I do, he's like Borges. So somehow, I guess, yes, without even reading him, I was influenced, because obviously he was influenced by the same influences I was influenced by. And more and more, but then in 1970, I made my short film with Borges, called Reading of the Text by Borges. And that's how I really got to think about what he really meant. But Borges is so complex that it's almost too much for me. I only grasp 10%, 15%. It's like trying to understand Mallarmé, how can you understand Mallarmé or Kafka, So you can only, with humility, you can understand a little bit. So I feel the same about Borges, but I really trying to still to understand him. I think he's so complex because it's like very interesting about 4 years ago I had some sort of cancer, and then I'm totally fine, I have to let you know. But when I was going from my house to the hospital, about 2 blocks before arriving to the hospital, it was the Borges Museum. So I got into his house every day, and I got to know of his objects, and it was like personal objects, things he liked, and that really helped me a lot in my radiation survey. Yeah.
Wonderful. Anyone else? You could maybe pass that.
Thanks. I actually want to return back to one of Daniel's questions about the sound in our time.
Yes.
And thinking about, I mean, Daniel talked a little bit about the clocks, but also thinking about, obviously clocks is a measure of time, but then the way that clicking continues on with the snapping of the camera, and then also the clicking of the typewriter. And that sound continues through those different areas of activity. And of course, clocks, photography, and writing are ways that you often pass the time, I believe, at least from what I can tell from your art. And so there's this question that I have about this impulse, or maybe this desire to measure time through these actions, but also thinking about your idea that time doesn't exist. So what does it mean to measure something that doesn't exist?
Well, it's trying to make sense of it somehow, trying to make sense of it, it's like, that's an interesting question, because in a way, when I started making films, I thought they were sculpture. So sculpture deals with time and space as well. So, and it raptures, like if you think of Cubist sculpture, it's about space and plane, it's about time. So in a way, they're like, in a way, if you look especially at the last one in our time, the story makes sense, but it doesn't really make sense. It does make sense, but it doesn't make sense. It's a little bit like Cubist painting that is fractured into segments, and you cannot make it up as you pay attention to it. And the soundtrack is together with the time of the motion picture and the time of the visuals, is a construction that help each other, sort of thing. And it's true, I like to them separate, because, for example, the Marguerite Duras interview, she's a writer, and she was a writer and a screenwriter. Let's not forget that she wrote several great movies, like Les Amants, Hiroshima, Mon Amour, etc., etc., etc. And she also does that with literature. She kind of raptures the process of fiction. So I guess those things, they, as much as Borges, influenced me, Yeah.
Yeah, I had trouble. I was trying, the several times I've watched the film, I was trying to figure out if you've set up at least 3 or 4 different moments in time, and I couldn't even decide, or if there were even like 2 different beginnings to this relationship, and they just kind of coexist in the same story. One where they meet while he's teaching, one where they meet while she's drawing. So it was very fragmented for me.
Yeah. But you got the story, right? Okay. Yeah.
I know there's more questions out there. I can feel them. Yes.
I was curious about the wall. It said that the falling wall, the title on it said that it was done in 1992.
In
So-
Milano, yeah.
In Milano. So what did it look like in Milan compared to now? In,
Oh,
in
well,
the
this
Broad?
is a completely free version of it.
Ah, okay.
No, this is like my answer to I build architectural. You know, I took the liberty of for first time, the wall doesn't join the ground. This goes from the window up there, you know. So that was a complete change, using the same concept to make actually a new piece, you know.
And was it at an angle to an angled wall?
Oh, it's exactly the same. Exactly the same. The only difference is that the original, and I made it several times after that, always departs from the connection between the wall and the ground. And this time goes, at the end of the window goes up, you know. But that's a liberty I took, and, you know, it's kind of, in that case, yeah.
Marcus beat you, Kenneth. Sorry. Marcus.
Thank you. So I'm just thinking about the spectacle of politics that you mentioned when referring to the Dictator and Manila Run. And, well, I'm Brazilian, and I'm really shocked at all the situation in that part of Latin America right now. And I'm just wondering, in comparison to your films here, what do you think that should be said today by filmmakers about the spectacle of politics in the contemporary context? I just want to listen to you a little bit more, like coming from the question that you made beforehand. And also, I'm interested in what you think that are the advantages of having a low production value and making films in this invention setting where you have all the freedom, which comes, I think, first before production value. Like, what are the advantages of creating in that setting?
Well, working with no budget, because, I mean, with the last one, I had some budget, but with the videos, I had no budget, you know, literally no budget. So, well, you know, it's when you have no food on the table, you have to somehow eat. So you are more desperate, and then somehow things take care of themselves, you know. Little by little, you know, I did try to work in Hollywood when I moved there, and I had screenplays. I did a lot of lunches and dinners and parties and all that. And I had a lot of friends who work in the industry, but then I realized that they never happened to make the film, and I did. You know, now they have I have friends of mine that really made a lot of money, and somehow the movies were never produced, because you can make money around. So it's a way of making money, really. So, and now I made my little films, but looking back, I did the right decision. With no money, I made my own thing, and I made personal things, and you know, I think if you have money, of course, it's better. You work more, but as an artist, it's the same. I had no money to all the early works that were made really in poverty, even though they look very well made. No, but that's interesting. I always manage to one of the things that I learned at the Dictator Institute in Argentina is to work with institutions within the institutional system. Because even though we had no money, I had the institution behind me. So what I did is, like, I got a letter from the curator of the institution with Dictator, and I went to, let's say, to manufacturers of aluminum. So because of they was going to be at the Dictator, they gave me maybe worth $50,000 worth of metal. And Philips and The same thing in Italy. I got all the furniture free from Oliveri because I was institutionalized because of biennial. Somehow, that answers your question, why the Getty is there behind the thing, you know. I guess I mean, because I am interested in what makes power. I'm interested in analyze power, how power works. In my modest little thing, you know, I'm very interested. Why a person without the abilities that they require, they gets to be the prime minister of some country or president of some country. It's about power. It's not about intelligence as we used to believe. But we stop right here.
Well, about the political question you asked, one detail that pops into my head is that I've seen, at least in interviews, you've said that for the Office of Information about the Vietnam War, that you chose the topic of the Vietnam War not necessarily to make a didactic political statement in 1968, right now is the 50th anniversary of this hallowed year of protest and riots and so on, but instead to use it because it was simply, in today's parlance, it was trending highest at the time. You know,
it was the highest rated news of that time. It was the Vietnam War. And that is true, but also I always believed, since I was this little, that war is wrong. Any war, whatever is Vietnam or any war is wrong. So it's a comment on war. I think killing each other is wrong.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm coming back to politics too, but I'm thinking of the politics of cinema. The first two films that you made, in a sense, are making politics not through their content, but the approach that they're taking. And at that time, one might have thought of imperfect cinema or cinema of hunger, which had preceded by about 10 years the time when you had made those films, 10, 15 years. And those were films which in fact take the minimum resources not as a restriction, but in fact as a virtue for the films that are being made. So I'm thinking here, what I really want to ask is these films deviate from the kinds of politics and power one would expect in the Hollywood fine, expensive, post-production kinds of films. They deviate from that in their own strange way. And I'm curious about the strangeness of the way in which they're not real, the way in which they don't use expensive decor and the rest of that, in order to make a film that's different from the politics and power of commercial cinema that everyone would have seen. So that's my question, that there's a kind of politics in the strangeness, in the weirdness, in the difference, in the unreality.
Well, in a way, yeah, in a way it's a political attitude. Yeah. I mean, I remember when I first arrived in LA, I knew very little about, American politics in a way, because, looking at this country from outside, being inside is quite different. And then one of my projects was I was very interested in Tom Hayden. You remember Tom Hayden? Sure. Well, and naive me, I wanted to make a documentary about, because following Tom Hayden campaigning. And then I just called a network, naive me, and I said that I would like to follow Tom Hayden, and they passed me through to another person. This is a strange call. And the last person said, we're not interested in Mr. Hayden or Mrs. Fonda politics, pop. And that was a shock. That was really a shock. And then I said, what did I do, So, and in a way, all these videos came as a result of that, of realizing that, how the news determines the thought of a nation, very much up to date.
So when you describe the BBC as opposed to the American.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, that's very interesting because even though they were very proper reading the news like this, there's also behind that serious face an ideology behind it, as much as here. The spectacle was different, you know.
It's still true today. With BBC, it's still true today.
Yes, it's still the same, yeah, and yeah, well, you know, that brings us to Brexit, you know. Another thing, you know, so. And, yeah, well, you know.
One would, you know, I remember Martha Rossler speaking to my students one time, and she said something to the effect of, you know, one of the worst things about staying as a political artist for this long is feeling like history is repeating itself again and again and again.
Well, that's very sad. Yeah, that's very sad because I thought that many things we were over. No, we're going back to the Middle Ages in many respects. But I feel that we have to be optimistic. I like to see those faces smiling. Come on. Okay. We have to be optimistic, yes. You have to be optimistic, yeah. Because there's, well, you know, I believe in art and expression, individual expression. Even though many things are happening we don't like, we still are able to create and think. So let's enjoy that.
I think that's a nice note to end on.